Hey everybody, welcome back. It's me, Shane, and with me again, Erica.
Always a pleasure.
She is our resident expert on pretty much everything.
Well, almost. I do try my best to be well-rounded.
You do a fantastic job. And today's deep dive is definitely unique. You know how much we love Kecia from Kecia's Tour Life?
Oh, absolutely.
Usually she's taking us, backstage at concerts or exploring these hidden, travel gems. But this time, she did something completely different. She went to a lecture about serial killers.
I know when I saw that blog post title, I had to do a double take. Not exactly Keisha's usual style. But that's what I love about her. Always willing to step outside her comfort zone.
Yeah, I think that's what makes her blog so fascinating. She's not afraid to explore really anything.
Yeah.
And this time, she took us along for the ride to this lecture led by criminologist Dr. Scott Bonn. And it took place at the historic Victoria Theater in Dayton, Ohio.
Ooh.
And Kecia describes it as this beautiful old theater, kind of spooky dimmed lights. You can practically feel the energy in her words.
Interesting how the setting can kind of add to a topic like this, right? It almost becomes another character in the story, a grand old theater. All this history adds a layer of intrigue.
It really does. And Kecia mentions that she was feeling a little apprehensive at first, which I can totally understand. But she said Dr. Bond had this way of making even a heavy topic, like serial killers, engaging, almost like he was telling a story.
That's a real skill, especially
Yeah.
with such a heavy topic. Instead of just listing facts and figures,
Right.
Dr. Bond used storytelling to really draw people in and try and understand what makes somebody become a serial killer. Is it nature? Is it nurture?
Well, he actually covered 6 high-profile cases in this lecture. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Aileen Wuornos, Richard Ramirez, better known as the Night Stalker, and even Jack the Ripper.
Wow, what a range.
Okay.
From the seemingly charming Ted Bundy to the completely chaotic Richard Ramirez,
Yeah.
each case offers a different perspective on criminal psychology. And then you add Jack the Ripper, the ultimate unsolved mystery. It just highlights how long we've been fascinated by this darker side of human nature.
And she started with Ted Bundy, who has almost become like the archetype of the charming, manipulative killer. She mentioned how Dr. Bond really deconstructed Bundy's persona and showed how he used his charisma as a weapon.
Just
Good point.
chilling, right? The wolf in sheep's clothing. It plays on our assumptions about people. We're naturally inclined to trust people who seem friendly and approachable. And Bundy really used that to his advantage, and it makes you wonder, right? Could you spot a Ted Bundy in a crowd?
Kecia mentioned that Dr. Bond called Bundy a sociopathic individual. What does that actually mean, like in a psychological sense?
Well, sociopath isn't actually a clinical diagnosis anymore. Today, it falls under what's called antisocial personality disorder. And the core traits are a disregard for social norms and the rights of others, a lack of empathy and remorse, and a tendency towards manipulative and deceitful behavior.
So Bundy's charm wasn't just a personality quirk. It was part of how he operated. Thinking about Kecia sitting in that theater listening to this must have been quite an experience.
Absolutely. And she wasn't just passively listening. Keisha's a sharp observer. She picks up on these insightful points. For example, she was really struck by John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, and the contrast between his public persona as this friendly community figure and the horrific reality of what he was doing.
Yeah, hiding bodies under his house, it's unimaginable.
Yeah.
How can someone compartmentalize like that and lead this double life? What do you think allowed him to maintain that facade for so long?
That's the question, isn't it? It gets at the heart of what makes these cases so disturbing. It challenges our assumptions about who we can trust and who poses a threat. Gacy was very good at manipulating people. He used his position of authority, his involvement in the community to create this smokescreen, and it worked for far too long.
It's like the way Kecia describes the atmosphere of the theater. The dimmed lights, the hushed anticipation. It's like she's setting the stage for the psychological thriller, and then she throws in a detail like that. Just sends chills down your spine.
It's like a horror movie. The tension keeps building with every detail. And this is just the beginning. We've got 4 more cases to unpack.
Oh, boy. I'm almost afraid to ask what's next.
Well, get ready, because we're moving on to Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh, boy.
Now, this is a case that even Kecia seemed to struggle to put into words. She mentions the disturbing escalation of his crimes, and I think that's putting it mildly. We're talking cannibalism, necrophilia, and these horrific experiments where he tried to create what he called zombies.
It's like something out of a nightmare, and it makes you wonder, what was going on in Dahmer's mind? Was he just driven by this desire to kill?
Hmm.
Or was there something more, some deeper psychological need driving these grotesque acts?
Yeah, that's where things get really complicated and unsettling. Dahmer's obsession with control is a recurring theme. In his case, the zombie experiments, for example, weren't just about taking lives. He wanted to create these beings that would be completely subservient to him, essentially eliminating their free will. It's a chilling example of how certain psychological drives can just become so distorted.
Keisha didn't go into a lot of detail about Dahmer in her blog post, but even the brief mentions that she did make are pretty haunting. Reading about these cases, it's easy to get caught up in the shock value, the gruesome details, but I think it's important to remember that behind every crime, there's a victim, a human life that was tragically cut short.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that, to remember the human cost of these crimes. And it's also why understanding the psychology of these offenders is so important. If we can identify the warning signs, the patterns of behavior, maybe we can prevent future tragedies.
Speaking of patterns, Keisha actually pointed out how Dr. Bonn used the case of Jack the Ripper, who terrorized London back in the 1880s, to illustrate the origins of criminal profiling. Even though the Ripper was never caught, the way investigators analyzed his crimes, looking for clues to his identity, and motivations really laid the groundwork for how we approach these cases today.
It's amazing to think about a case from over a century ago still shaping how we understand criminal behavior. It shows that the drive to understand the why behind these acts is something that's fascinated us for generations.
And it's not just historical cases. Keisha's blog post made me realize that even with modern-day serial killers, there's often this sense of mystery of trying to piece together this puzzle. Take Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, for example. Kecia wrote about how Dr. Bond emphasized the chaotic nature of his crimes, his apparent lack of a clear motive, how that made it even more terrifying.
Ramirez really embodies that idea of unpredictable evil. He wasn't targeting specific types of victims. He didn't have a consistent modus operandi, and he seemed to relish in the terror that he inflicted. It's like he wanted to create this sense of fear that extended far beyond his actual victims, a feeling that anyone could be next.
And that randomness, that lack of a clear pattern must made him incredibly difficult to catch, right?
Exactly. He was a phantom striking seemingly at random, which made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to predict his next move. It's that uncertainty, that sense of vulnerability that makes these types of cases so unsettling.
Okay, so we've got Bundy, the charming manipulator, Gacy hiding in plain sight. Dahmer, driven by this need for control. Ramirez embodying pure chaos, and then there's Aileen Wuornos, who offers a very different perspective on this whole phenomenon. She was one of the few female serial killers to gain notoriety. And Kecia noted that Dr. Bond discussed her troubled past and how societal factors might have played a role in her crimes.
Warnos's case is so fascinating and tragic. While it's never right to justify taking a life, understanding the complex interplay of factors that may have contributed to your actions is important. She experienced severe trauma and abuse throughout her life, and she was operating within a system that often failed to protect vulnerable women.
It's a reminder that there's always a context, a story behind the headlines, and while understanding the psychology of someone like Aileen Wuornos doesn't excuse her actions, it does offer a glimpse into the dark side of human experience, the ways in which trauma and societal pressures can have these devastating consequences.
It raises some challenging questions, doesn't it? What is our responsibility as a society to address the root causes of violence? How do we balance individual accountability with a recognition of these systemic factors that can contribute to criminal behavior?
These are questions that Kecia probably didn't anticipate grappling with when she decided to attend this lecture. But that's the thing about learning, isn't it? It often takes us in unexpected directions, challenging our assumptions and pushing us to confront these uncomfortable truths.
And who better to guide us on that journey than Kecia from Kecia's Tour Life? I have a feeling she left that theater with a whole lot more than just a few spooky stories. She probably walked out with a deeper understanding of human nature, both its light and its shadow.
That's what I love about her blog. She's not afraid to dive into the deep end, to explore the world in all its complexity, and she takes us along for the ride, making us think, feel, and maybe even question our own perceptions.
It's a wild ride for sure, but I wouldn't want to miss it.
Before we wrap up our deep dive into Dr. Bond's lecture, I have to ask you, Erica, as our resident expert, what intrigues you most about the psychology of serial killers?
Ooh, That is a tough one. Uh, there are so many layers to unravel when it comes to these extreme cases, but I think for me, it's that constant tension, between trying to find patterns in their behavior and accepting that sometimes there just isn't a neat explanation. It's that push and pull between our desire for order and the chaotic reality of human nature.
So you're saying that even with all the advances in criminal psychology and profiling, there's still this element of the unknown, the unpredictable.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so compelling, right? We're constantly seeking to understand what drives someone to commit such horrific acts. But the human mind is complex, it's contradictory. Sometimes the answers are more about individual psychology, like Dahmer's need for control. Other times it's about societal factors, like the systemic failures that may have contributed to Aileen Wuornos's trajectory. And sometimes it's this murky combination of both, and we're left with more questions than answers.
It makes you realize that even in a world obsessed with true crime, documentaries, and podcasts, there are still so many mysteries surrounding the minds of serial killers.
And that's where the ethical considerations come in, when you say,
Yeah.
how do we satisfy our curiosity about these cases without sensationalizing them or exploiting the victims? It's a delicate balance.
Yeah, you want to learn from these tragedies, right? And understand the warning signs of the patterns that might help prevent future crimes. But at the same time, you don't want to turn these real-life horrors into entertainment.
Exactly. It's about approaching these topics with sensitivity and respect, recognizing that behind every case file, there are real people who suffered unimaginable loss.
And I think Kecia did a great job of conveying that in her blog post. She didn't shy away from the disturbing details, but she also highlighted the human element, the impact these crimes had on the victims and their families.
That's what makes Keisha such a compelling storyteller. She takes us on these journeys with her, whether it's to a concert, a travel destination, or even a lecture on serial killers, and she always manages to find the heart of the matter, the human connection that makes it all resonate.
And she does it with this infectious enthusiasm, this sense of adventure that makes you want to follow her anywhere, even if it means confronting some pretty dark subjects along the way.
It's like she's saying, hey, life is full of surprises, and sometimes those surprises take us to unexpected places, but let's explore them together with open minds and a willingness to learn.
I think that's a great note to end on. So if you're ready for an adventure and maybe a few chills along the way, be sure to check out Keisha's blog, Keisha's Tour Life. You can also find her on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. She's got something for everyone, from music lovers to travel enthusiasts to, well, maybe even armchair criminologists.
Just make sure to double check those locks before you go to bed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of serial killers. Until next time, stay curious.